The annual Whitmore Global Charity Gala glittered under crystal chandeliers, where hundreds of executives and donors raised their glasses to fund treatment for patients in need, and not one of them spared a glance for the janitor quietly working the floor among all those expensive suits. Not until Logan Pierce happened to stand one step away from the daughter of Chief Executive Vanessa Whitmore and saw something strange inside her ear. Something more than 10 leading specialists had missed for 8 years. Less than a minute later, the entire ballroom went silent. Who was that janitor, and what else did he know? The floor of the Whitmore Global Ballroom was polished until the chandeliers doubled themselves in it, and Logan Pierce had been keeping it that way since 4 in the afternoon. He worked the perimeter with a cart and a folded towel, moving in the narrow band between the wall and the tables, the way he moved in every building he had ever cleaned. The trick was to become part of the architecture. Waiters saw him. Nobody else did. That suited him, because being invisible meant nobody asked questions he had stopped answering. The contract had come through an agency 11 months earlier, and he had taken it because the hours worked around his son's class schedule and because it paid without asking what he had done before. Ethan was 21 now, studying engineering across town, and the two of them ran a life on a narrow margin. There had been a time when the household held a third person, and when she was still in it, Logan's days had looked nothing like this. He did not think about that on shift. He had trained himself out of it. Above him, the gala did what galas do. 300 people in evening dress had come to raise money for a treatment fund, and the room had the pleasant hum of people feeling good about themselves. A screen at the far end cycled pledge totals. Someone announced that the evening had passed $1.5 million, and the applause came up in a wave Logan felt through the soles of his shoes before he heard it. Vanessa Whitmore stood near the base of the stage holding a glass she had not touched. She had given the same welcome for 6 years running, and she gave it well, because that was the job, and because the fund carried her family's name. What the room did not know was that she had spent the 20 minutes before the doors opened on the phone with a clinic in Boston, listening to a specialist explain in the gentle voice they all used that there was nothing further to try. Her daughter Layla was 26 and had not heard a sound in 8 years. That was the sentence Vanessa had learned to say without her voice moving. 11 specialists had arrived at the same place by different roads. Bilateral sensorineural failure, irreversible. The first 2 had said it carefully. The rest had said it the way you tell someone their house is already burned down. Layla stood a few steps away in a dark green dress, reading the room, the way she read everything now watching mouths and hands and the tilt of shoulders. She had come because her mother asked, and because the fund was in a way nobody said out loud built around her. She signed something short. Vanessa signed back badly the way she always did, and Layla's mouth moved into something close to a smile. Logan was working the section behind them when a server clipped a tray and a champagne flute went down on the marble. It did not shatter so much as burst, throwing glass in a bright spray across 4 feet of floor. Half the room turned toward the sound. Logan was already moving cart-first towel out because that was the job, and because the glass had landed 6 inches from an open-toed shoe. He crouched at the edge of the mess and began pulling the larger pieces toward the center. The woman in the green dress had not turned. She was still facing the stage, still watching a man's mouth move at the microphone, and she had not moved a muscle when the glass went off directly behind her. Logan noticed that the way he noticed everything without deciding to. Then she stepped back to give him room, and the chandelier light crossed the side of her face at an angle, and he stopped. There was a reflection in her right ear canal. Not the ordinary wet shine of tissue. A flat, cold glint, deep and slightly off-axis, the way light returns off a machined surface rather than off skin. It lasted less than a second, because she turned her head and then it was gone. Logan finished the glass. He wrapped the towel, set it in the cart, and stood there with both hands on the handle while the room went on around him. He had spent 4 years as a special operations corpsman, and years after that inside a problem nobody had asked him to solve, and neither of those things appeared on his employment record. He knew what he had seen. He also knew exactly how it would sound coming out of his mouth in this room. He looked at the service door, then at the woman in the green dress. Then he pushed the cart forward and did the thing he had promised himself he would never do again, which was to make himself visible. Vanessa registered him first as an interruption in her sight line, a man in a work shirt with a cart 4 feet away waiting to be acknowledged. Her assistant moved to intercept, and Logan spoke before the intercept landed. "Miss Whitmore, your daughter needs a scan tonight." 3 or 4 people nearby stopped talking. Vanessa turned fully toward him and took him in down to the contractor badge clipped at his belt. "Excuse me, there's something in her right ear," Logan said. "It isn't tissue. It reflects light like metal." The assistant put a hand near his elbow without quite touching it. Vanessa did not move. She had spent 20 years being approached at events by people with theories, and she had a practiced way of ending those conversations, and she found she was not using it. "My daughter has been examined by 11 specialists," she said. "Over 8 years. 2 of them are the best in the country." "I believe you." "Then you understand what you're saying." "I understand it's a strange thing to hear from a man holding a mop," Logan said. "It's still what I saw. It's roughly 9 to 11 millimeters in, seated deep against the wall of the canal, and it's angled. You only catch it if the light crosses at about 30 degrees. Every otoscope in the world puts its light straight down the axis and straight down the axis. You would never see it. You'd see the drum, you'd see normal anatomy, and you'd write a normal exam." Vanessa set her glass on the nearest table without looking at it. What reached her was not his confidence. She had been sold confidence for 8 years by men in better clothes. It was the specificity. 11 millimeters, 30 degrees. Nobody inventing a story to get near her money would invent numbers that could be checked in 4 minutes. "Who are you?" she said. It did not come out as a question. "Logan Pierce. I clean this building on contract 4 nights a week." He glanced at Layla, who had turned now, watching their faces with the alert stillness of someone who understands a conversation is about her and cannot hear a word of it. "There's a doctor in this room. There are probably 8. Get one and have them look at her with the light held off to the side. That's all I'm asking. If I'm wrong, I walk out and you never see me again." A woman near the stage had been listening for the last 30 seconds. Ellen Grant ran a neurology group that had given $100,000 to the fund that night, and she had spent most of the evening trying to leave early. She'd stepped through the small crowd with her reading glasses already in her hand. "Say the angle again," she said to Logan. 30 degrees off axis, right ear, deep. Dr. Grant looked at Vanessa, and Vanessa gave a single nod. Layla let her mother explain with hands and a phone screen, then sat down in a banquet chair someone pulled out, turned her head to the side and held very still, because 8 years had made her extremely good at holding still while people examined her. There was no otoscope. There was a phone flashlight and a folded program used as a shade, and Dr. Grant crouched and worked the beam across the opening of the canal at a shallow angle, sweeping it slowly the way you sweep a field. The room noise dropped in stages. First the tables nearest them, then the ones behind. By the time it reached the far wall, someone had killed the music, and 300 people in evening dress stood in complete silence, watching a doctor kneel on a marble floor with a phone in her hand. When she pulled back, her hand was not steady, and everyone close enough to see. It saw it. "There's a foreign body in the canal," she said. "It isn't organic." Vanessa heard the words and did not process them. She heard herself ask the doctor to repeat it, and heard the doctor repeat it, and still did not process it. What she processed was a single image that arrived from 8 years back and would not leave a man with a soft voice explaining that this was permanent, and Vanessa standing behind him agreeing. "Then all of them," Vanessa said. "All 11. "I'm not going to speculate in a ballroom," Dr. Grant said, "but she needs imaging tonight, and she needs an ear surgeon, and I can have both inside an hour." The gala ended without anyone formally ending it. The screen at the end of the room was still cycling pledge totals, while the room emptied, and nobody stopped to look at it. Layla was told what was happening in the corridor outside on her mother's phone screen, in text large enough to fill it. She read it twice. Then she looked up, found Logan standing near the service door with his cart, and held his eyes several seconds longer than was comfortable for either of them. She did not smile. Imaging confirmed it in under 20 minutes. A small rectangular density seated hard against the bony wall of the right canal, and a second one on the left, deeper and smaller. Both had appeared in scans going back years, sitting in the corner of images where 3 separate radiologists had read them as bone fragments left over from an old injury. The surgeon who came in at 2 in the morning was named Samuel Brandt, and he had been doing this for 19 years. He told Vanessa plainly that he had never seen anything like it, and that he intended to remove both objects before sunrise. While the consent forms were being signed, Dr. Grant pulled the older scans up on a second monitor, and it went through them backward year by year until she reached the earliest set. The shapes were there in every one. She stood looking at them for a while, and then told Vanessa, because it was going to come out anyway, that the finding had been available to anyone willing to look at the images instead of at the report attached to them. Logan did not come upstairs. He waited in the ground floor lobby with his badge still clipped to his belt, and when a security officer asked him twice whether he was there for someone, he said he was there for nobody, and kept sitting. The extraction took 90 minutes. Dr. Brandt came out holding a steel tray with 2 objects on it, each smaller than a grain of rice, each trailing a filament thinner than a hair. "They're not medical," he said. "Nothing about them is medical. Somebody put these in deliberately, and somebody did it well enough that they've stayed seated for years." Vanessa looked at the tray for a long time, then asked the only question that mattered. "Will she hear?" "Her nerve is intact on both sides. That much I can tell you now," Dr. Brandt said. "I can't tell you what 8 years of interference has done to the pathway. She may hear tomorrow. She may hear in pieces over months. She may hear and hate it." Layla woke at 6 in the morning. Her mother had been sitting on the left side of the bed for 4 hours. Dr. Brandt stood at the foot of it, and when Layla opened her eyes, he did not speak. He lifted one hand and snapped his fingers once near the right side of her head. Layla flinched. It was not a graceful moment. Her whole shoulder came up. Her eyes went wide. One hand went to her ear, and the sound she made was not a word, but a raw, startled noise. She looked around the room with an expression closer to fear than joy. Vanessa put both hands over her own mouth and made no sound at all, because 8 years had taught her that her daughter could not hear her cry, and her body had not caught up to the news. "That's a response," Dr. Brandt said. "That's a real response." Around 9 that morning, Vanessa walked into the corridor and found the janitor still there sitting in a plastic chair by the elevators, having not gone home, having not asked anyone for anything, holding a cup of vending machine coffee he had let go cold. She stood in front of him and realized she did not know what to say to a man who had just undone 8 years of her life in under a minute. "She reacted," Vanessa said. He snapped his fingers and she reacted. Something went out of Logan's shoulders that had been in them all night. "You saw it from 6 feet away in a dark ballroom," Vanessa said. 11 specialists with equipment I paid for did not. "So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like a real answer. What are you?" Logan stood and dropped the cold coffee in the bin. "I'm the guy who cleans your east wing," he said. 4 nights a week. Thursdays I do the garage." He walked to the elevator and let the doors close, and Vanessa Whitmore stood in that corridor, understanding with complete clarity that the man had just lied to her and that she intended to find out exactly how. The lab report came back 11 days later, and it was worse than anyone had prepared for. The 2 objects were not implants in any medical sense. Each held a filament electrode seated against the cochlear wall, a circuit and an induction coil, and each had done one job continuously for 8 years, which was to deliver a low-level electrical field tuned precisely to block signal transmission along the auditory nerve. It had not damaged the nerve. It had stood in front of it and refused to let anything through. Dr. Grant delivered the finding in a fourth-floor conference room with the scans on a screen. She had read the file 3 times before she would say the sentence out loud, and she said it looking directly at Vanessa. Your daughter was never deaf. Not for one day. Her hearing was switched off and held off by a machine for 8 years. Vanessa did not react the way people expected. She sat still and asked how it had been missed, and Dr. Grant gave her the truth, which was that it had not been missed so much as designed around. The devices sat where an otoscope's own light blinded the examiner to them. On standard imaging, they read as bone fragments, and every specialist after the first 2 had worked from a file that already contained a diagnosis. No doctor in the country re-examines a canal after 4 colleagues have written it off. There's one more thing, Dr. Grant said. These have no battery worth the name. They ran on induction. Somebody had to bring a charging coil within a few inches of her head roughly every 3 weeks for 8 years. This wasn't done to her once. It was maintained. Vanessa hired an investigator named Cole Redmond that afternoon, gave him 8 years of household records, medical billing, and staff files, and told him she wanted to know who had been standing closest to her daughter the whole time. It took Redmond 19 days, and he laid it out without softening any of it. The devices had gone in during a 2-day hospital stay 8 years earlier after a fall from a horse recorded as a moderate concussion. The woman who brought Layla in stayed both nights and signed the discharge paperwork was Marlene Rourke, who had been employed by the household for 6 years by then and trusted with everything. Rourke had also traveled with Layla, shared her home, and been within arm's reach of her nearly every week since. Every subsequent referral ran through one name. The second specialist Layla ever saw had recommended the third. The third had recommended the fifth. Preston Hale sat at the center of the referral tree like a spider, and Hale had never held a medical license in any state. His credentials were purchased, his publications did not exist, and the practice address on his letterhead had been a mail drop in a strip mall for the entire 8 years. Pfft, he wasn't treating her, Redmond said. He was managing the file. Every doctor after him inherited his conclusion. Vanessa asked why, and Redmond opened a second folder, and the answer was smaller and uglier than the crime. Layla's grandfather's trust released a controlling block of Whitmore Global shares to her on her 28th birthday. The block came with a board seat, and the trust required that the beneficiary be able to participate in board proceedings directly. A beneficiary who could not communicate without assistance kept the shares but voted them through a designated household proxy appointed by the trust and answerable to no one for as long as the condition lasted. The trust named that proxy by role, primary caretaker of record. Marlene Rourke had held that title since the day of the discharge paperwork. She wasn't trying to hurt her, Redmond said. She was making herself the only door in the room. 2 years from now, Rourke votes a controlling block of your company, and nobody can remove her. Hale took $200,000 a year out of an account Rourke controlled to keep the diagnosis stuck. Vanessa read the figure twice. 8 years of her daughter's life had cost somebody $1 6/10 million, and they had considered it a bargain. There was a third folder thinner than the others. Redmond set it down last. You also asked me about the janitor, he said. This is everything a private investigator can legally obtain about Logan Pierce, and it's 4 pages. Honorable discharge, no unit listed. Everything before that is sealed at a level I can't reach, and neither can you. In 19 years, I've pulled 2 files like this. Both belong to men who were very good at something the government preferred not to advertise. Marlene Rourke was arrested on a Tuesday morning at a rental house 2 hours north, with the charging coil in a case in her closet. Preston Hale was picked up 4 days later at an airport holding a boarding pass bought with cash. Vanessa signed the paperwork and went back to work, because the arrests did not fix the part that actually mattered. The part that actually mattered was that Layla could hear, and it was going very badly. 8 years of silence had left her auditory cortex without practice, and now every sound in the world arrived at full volume with no ranking. A refrigerator compressor hit as hard as a voice. Traffic came through a closed window like something physical. She could not tell which direction anything came from, and she could not tell what mattered. Speech was worse than noise. The words were still in her, but she could not hear the shape of them when she made them, and she could not separate a sentence from the room it was spoken in. Her mother's voice, the thing she had wanted most, arrived as a smear inside a wash of everything else. By the 5th week, she had stopped leaving the house. By the 7th, she was wearing the noise-blocking earmuffs the audiologist had given her 14 hours a day. The clinical team called it sensory overload and prescribed graduated exposure, which meant 20-minute sessions in a padded room with recorded tones. Layla walked out of the 4th one and did not go back. Vanessa found her that night sitting in the dark on the kitchen floor with the earmuffs on. When the light came on, Layla signed one sentence and would not sign anything else. She had said it was quieter before. Logan heard none of this. 2 days after the gala, he had called the agency and asked to be moved off the Whitmore contract to a warehouse property across the river, and the agency had been happy to oblige, and he had not explained himself to anyone, including his son. Vanessa's assistant left 3 messages. He returned none of them. She found him herself on a Thursday night in the parking structure of a building he had never worked in, standing by his cart in a coat over the clothes she had worn to a board meeting. "She's regressing," Vanessa said. "She's had her hearing back for 9 weeks, and she wants it gone. Nobody I've hired knows what to do with that." Logan leaned on the cart handle. "What are they doing?" "Tones in a soundproof room, 20 minutes at a time. Then they're teaching her that sound is something that happens to her. In a box," he said. "The problem isn't her ears. Her ears are fine. Her brain hasn't been given a reason to sort anything, and you can't sort a world you're not allowed to touch." "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 6 years doing it wrong," Logan said, and stopped himself, and it was clear to both of them that he had come near an edge and stepped back from it. He gave her the outline instead. Sound had to be attached to something the body was already doing, or the brain would never bother to file it. He had watched blast-exposed men relearn spatial hearing, not in booths, but by walking a line while somebody spoke from changing positions, because motion gave the brain a reason to care where a sound came from. Touch dragged hearing along behind it. A hand on a speaker cone while a voice came out of it taught the cortex more in 10 minutes than an hour of tones. "She needs to move," he said. "She needs sound tied to her own hands and her own feet, and she needs to hold the volume control herself, because right now, every single thing in her life is being decided for her, and sound is just one more item on the list." Vanessa asked him to write it down. He said he would rather show her. He came on a Sunday and brought a portable speaker and a length of cotton rope. Layla was in the sitting room with the earmuffs on. Logan did not ask her to take them off. He set the speaker on the floor, put her hand flat on top of it, and turned it on at a level so low that nothing came out but a slow vibration under her palm. He let her sit with that for 10 minutes, brought it up. One increment watched her face, and when she did not flinch, he left it there and let another 10 minutes pass. He gave her the volume control before he gave her anything else. By the 3rd session, the earmuffs were off for an hour at a time. By the 2nd week, she was walking the length of the hall with her eyes closed and one hand on the rope he had strung along the wall while he moved and spoke from different points in the room, and her job was to point at him. She missed by 90 degrees the first day. By the 4th, she was inside 30. By the end of the 3rd week, she could find him in a room with the television running, which the clinical team had said would take a year. She started coming downstairs. She left the earmuffs on the hall table. In the 5th week, she asked Logan a question out loud in her own voice, and it came out flat and too loud, and she heard that it was too loud, and she said it again, quieter. That correction was the thing that made Vanessa leave the room so nobody would see her face. Ethan started coming along on Sundays because his father was gone most of the day, and it beat eating alone. He turned out to be useful in a way Logan had not planned. He put his hand on the speaker cabinet at the same time Layla did, so she had someone to compare against, and he talked to her without slowing down, which every clinician had done and which she had hated. They argued about a movie in the kitchen for 40 minutes while she caught maybe half of it, and she did not once ask him to repeat himself. By month 5, Layla scored inside the normal range on word recognition in quiet. By month 7, she was holding conversations in restaurants. Dr. Grant reviewed the data twice and told Vanessa there was no published protocol that produced these numbers on this timeline. That was when Vanessa stopped thinking of it as her daughter's recovery and started thinking of it as something else. She brought it to the executive floor on a Monday. Whitmore Global would fund a research and rehabilitation program for auditory recovery built on Logan's method run through the fund that already carried the family name. First cohort inside a year, Logan running the clinical side. The 4 of them were eating together most Sundays by then, and none of them called it what it was. There was an evening in the 8th month when Ethan and Layla were arguing about speaker placement in the hall, and Vanessa looked across the room and found Logan already looking at her, and neither of them said anything, and both understood the shape of what was happening. The board did not. Richard Doyle had sat on that board for 16 years and chaired the audit committee for 9, and he opened the quarterly meeting with a folder in front of him. I want the record to show what we're being asked to approve. A clinical program at a company with no clinical division, with a director who holds no medical degree, no license, no institutional affiliation, and no publications. His employment history with this company is a janitorial contract through a staffing agency. He turned a page. There is also the question of what this looks like. A contract worker approaches the chief executive at a company function. 14 months later, he runs a funded program and eats dinner at her house. I am not making an accusation. I'm telling you that any reporter in this city could write that paragraph without a single false word in it. Vanessa did not wait for the chair to recognize her. Then let me put my own words in the record, she said. 11 licensed specialists examined my daughter. I chose them. I paid for them. Every one of them was wrong. And they were wrong in part because each of them was too senior to question the one before. The man in the work shirt was the only person in 8 years who looked at her instead of at her file. I will not sit at this table and pretend that a credential is the same thing as competence, because I bought 11 credentials, and they cost my daughter 8 years of her life. If this board wants to remove him, it can start by removing me. The motion carried anyway narrowly. The program was suspended pending a full review of the clinical lead's qualifications, and an outside panel was appointed, and the panel's first act was to summon Logan Pierce to explain by what authority he had been treating a patient at all. He came alone without counsel and sat at the end of a table with 9 people at it. What Doyle had not read, because it existed in no file the company held Logan put on the table one document at a time. 4 years as a corpsman, attached to a Navy SEAL team with a subspecialty in blast-related auditory trauma. 61 field cases of acute acoustic injury managed under his hand. A protocol for spatial hearing rehabilitation, written in the field adopted by 2 medical units and still in use, filed in the literature under a unit designation rather than a name, because nothing written in that job carried a name. Dr. Grant testified for 90 minutes and told the panel she had measured the method against everything published in the last decade and found it not merely sound, but ahead of the field. The panel recessed and set its final session for the following Thursday. On the way out, Doyle stopped beside Logan's chair and asked the question the whole proceeding had been circling. 6 years, Doyle said. You told the chief executive you spent 6 years doing it wrong. Doing what wrong exactly? Because that isn't in any of these files either." Logan gathered his documents and did not answer. The question followed him out of the building and was still with him 4 days later, when Vanessa came to his apartment for the first time. Doyle had filed a supplementary request in the meantime, demanding that the clinical lead account for any prior work in auditory recovery, formal or otherwise, and Vanessa had read it and understood the man was no longer fishing. He had found something. She sat at a kitchen table with a chipped corner, while Logan poured coffee neither of them drank. Ethan had gone out on purpose. On the shelf behind Logan, there was a photograph of a woman in a hospital chair with a blanket over her knees, and Vanessa had seen it the moment she walked in and had not asked. "Her name was Claire," Logan said. "She was my wife. Doyle's people will have her death certificate by Monday, so you should hear it from me first." He told it the way he did everything in order, without decoration. Claire had been diagnosed at 31 with a progressive condition that stripped the coating from her nerves. It took her balance first, then her fine motor control, and in the 4th year it reached the auditory pathway and began eating the 8th cranial nerve the way it had eaten everything else. The neurologists gave her a timeline for her hearing and were accurate to within about 6 weeks. "They told us it was untreatable, and they were right," he said. "I didn't accept it, so I spent 6 years trying to be smarter than everyone who had ever studied the problem." He was out of the service by then, working nights, so he could sit with her in the day. He read every paper published on nerve conduction and cortical plasticity, and when he could not get the papers, he wrote to the authors, and some of them wrote back. He built the first version of the method on the floor of their living room with a speaker cabinet and a length of rope, because Claire's balance was going, and she needed something to hold. He tracked her responses on graph paper for 6 years. 411 sheets of it sat in a box under his bed, and he had never shown them to anyone. "For about 18 months it worked," he said. "She could locate a voice. She could follow a conversation with the television on. I thought I had found something. Then the disease reached the nerve itself, and there was nothing left on the other side of the training to train. Claire lost the last of her hearing over one autumn, and lived 14 months after that in a silence Logan had spent 6 years building a bridge into and could no longer cross. The method works on a nerve that's intact, he said. Layla's was intact the whole time. Claire's was being eaten. I knew that by the 4th year, and I kept going anyway because stopping meant agreeing with them. Vanessa asked the question she had carried since the hospital corridor. Why he had said nothing. Why a man with 400 pages of data and a protocol in field use had spent 11 months pushing a cart through her building at night. Because everything I know I learned failing to save my wife, Logan said. Every number in that box came off her body. I couldn't put that on a resume and hand it to a staffing agency. And after she died, I didn't want to be the man who knew things about ears. I wanted to be nobody for a while. I was good at it. Then I looked into your daughter's ear. Vanessa sat with that. She had spent 14 months assuming she owed him gratitude, and understood now that gratitude was the wrong currency entirely. The thing that had saved Layla in under a minute had been assembled over 6 years by a man watching someone he loved lose the same sense in a living room on graph paper for nothing. You gave her back what you couldn't give Claire, Vanessa said. I gave her back what Claire paid for, he said. That's not the same sentence. He told her he intended to withdraw. Doyle would put Claire's file in front of the panel, and the story would come out as a widower with a private obsession running an unlicensed program at a public company, and it would not matter that it was true or that it worked. The program would die, and the funding line with it, and there were 409 applications already sitting in intake from families who had been given the same word Vanessa had been given 11 times. If I walk now, the program survives without me. Put a licensed director in the chair and run the protocol under their name. Vanessa told him no, and told him why. The protocol was not a document. It was a set of judgments about when to push and when to stop, and every one of them lived in the man across the table, and she had watched him make 40 of them on her own kitchen floor. Handing the paper to a stranger would produce a program that performed the movements without knowing what they were for. "And there's the other thing," she said. "Doyle asked what you did wrong for 6 years. You weren't wrong. You were early." The final session convened Thursday morning in the same room with a court reporter at the end of the table, because someone had decided the proceeding needed a record. Doyle opened by placing Claire Pierce's file on the table and describing it in the flattest terms available. A spouse, a terminal diagnosis, 6 years of undocumented, unsupervised intervention conducted in a private residence by a man with no license, subsequently applied to the daughter of this company's chief executive. "I am not questioning his grief," Doyle said. "I am questioning whether a grief-driven experiment belongs on our balance sheet." Logan asked to respond, and the chair allowed it. He did not defend himself. He opened the box he had brought and began laying the 411 sheets along the length of the table in date order, and kept laying them out until they ran the full 19 feet of it, and he had to start a second row. This is the entire data set. Every session, every score, every failure. You'll notice most of it is failure. Sheet 206 is the day the method started working. Sheet 340 is the day it stopped, because the nerve underneath it was gone. I have never claimed this treats nerve loss. I have said from the beginning that it treats a functioning nerve that has been denied practice. That is a narrow claim. It is the only claim I have ever made, and it is on this table in my handwriting from 6 years before I heard the name Whitmore. Dr. Grant, who had already testified once, asked the chair for 2 minutes and got them. She said that, in 22 years, she had never seen a protocol submitted with its own failures laid out in front of its successes, and that the sheets on the table were a longitudinal record of unusual quality, and that the field had been publishing weaker material for decades under better letterhead. Dr. Brandt was blunter. He told the panel that he had removed 2 devices from a patient declared permanently deaf by 11 licensed specialists, that the licensing had not helped her, and that if the man at the end of the table had walked past that ballroom, instead of stopping, all 11 of them would still be right. Layla asked to speak. Nobody had put her on the schedule. She stood at the end of the table and spoke without notes, in a voice that still carried the slight flatness of someone learning her own volume from the outside, and she did not slow down for anyone. She said that 11 experts had examined her, and every one of them had talked to her mother about her instead of talking to her. She said the first person who asked her what she wanted had been a contractor in a work shirt, who put a volume knob in her hand before he put anything else in it. "You are debating whether he is qualified," she said. "I am the qualification. I am standing in a room with 9 people breathing a ventilation system running, and a pen scratching at the far end of this table, and I know where every one of those sounds is coming from. 8 years ago, somebody was paid $200,000 a year to make sure I would never do that again. He is the only reason I can hear this sentence. Vote however you want." The panel deliberated 2 hours and returned unanimous. The program was reinstated. The clinical lead's qualifications were entered into the record as established by demonstrated competence and field service with Dr. Grant, appointed licensed medical director of record for regulatory purposes, and Logan Pierce as program director. Doyle voted with the majority. On his way out, he stopped where the sheets were still spread and looked down the length of them. "Dr. 340, he said. "That's where it stopped." Logan told him it was. "I read the whole file on your wife. I want you to know I did the job I was seated to do, and I'd do it again." Doyle set a card on the table. "I also want you to know my brother lost his hearing in a plant accident in the 1990s, and nobody ever offered him anything but a pamphlet. Send me the intake criteria." The criminal case closed 11 weeks later. Marlene Rourke pleaded to aggravated assault conspiracy and fraud and took 22 years. Preston Hale went to trial on the theory that he had offered opinions rather than treatment. The jury took under 4 hours, and he received 18 years plus restitution he would never finish paying. The proxy clause was voided in probate, and the shares released to Layla on schedule. She did not take the board seat. She took a job running intake for the program instead, on the grounds that she was the only person in the building who had sat on the other side of that desk and been told the word permanent by someone in a good suit. Her first rule for the intake team was that nobody's file traveled ahead of them. Every applicant was examined as though no one had ever examined them before, and the prior diagnosis stayed sealed until after the exam was written. Dr. Grant argued against it for a month on grounds of efficiency, then stopped arguing when the second cohort turned up 2 patients whose problems had nothing to do with what their paperwork said. The first cohort opened 14 months after the hearing. 30 patients, all adults with intact nerve pathways and no functional hearing, all of them told at some point by somebody credentialed that there was nothing further to try. 26 of the 30 reached conversational recognition inside 9 months. 2 did not respond. 2 had underlying nerve damage the method could not touch, and Logan told both of them so on the first day because he had learned at sheet 340 what happens when nobody says it. The graph paper was photographed indexed and published as an appendix to the program's first paper. The paper carried Dr. Grant's name and Logan's in that order at his insistence. Under the acknowledgments, there was one line: the underlying dataset was collected over 6 years on a single participant, Claire Pierce, who did not recover. Vanessa read that line more times than she read the rest of the paper. She had spent her life on a particular arithmetic in which value rose with position, and the closer a person sat to the top of a room, the likelier they were to be the one who could solve something. 11 of the most credentialed people in the country had stood over her daughter and gotten it wrong for 8 years. The man who got it right had been holding a towel, and everything in his life had told him to keep walking. She said a version of that from the same stage in the same ballroom at the program's opening. She said the fund had spent 6 years raising money in that room, while the person who most needed it stood 40 feet from the microphone, and nobody had noticed because they had all been looking up. The 4 of them still ate together on Sundays. Ethan finished his degree and joined the program's engineering side building tactile trainers out of materials considerably better than a borrowed speaker and a length of rope. Vanessa and Logan stopped explaining themselves to people somewhere in the second year. There was no announcement. Layla worked it out before either of them said anything, told Ethan, and Ethan said he had known for a year and a half. The last thing happened on an ordinary evening in the program's rehearsal room, which was the one space in the building with a piano in it, because Logan had insisted on a room where sound could be made rather than only received. Layla had not touched an instrument in 11 years. She sat down, put one finger on a key and held it, then played 4 notes in sequence, listening to each one land and adjusting the next by what she heard rather than by what she remembered. It was not a piece. It was not anything anyone would have recognized. It was a sound she had chosen produced and heard herself produce in that order for the first time since the night somebody closed the door on her. Vanessa stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, the same gesture as the hospital room, and this time her daughter heard her and turned around. Logan stayed at the back of the room. He was thinking about a living room floor and a woman in a chair, with a blanket over her knees, and about 6 years of graph paper that had bought nothing at the time and had now bought 26 people a world back. Claire had not recovered. Everything in that room existed because of her anyway, and he understood at last that those were not 2 separate facts. Layla played the 4 notes again, got the third one closer, and kept going.